Hello, this is Koç University Design Lab. In this episode, we host the author of Design of Everyday Thing, Don Norman. I'm connecting to California right now. Hi, Don.
Good morning or good evening.
Good evening to you. Don, as you know, 10 years ago, we opened an interdisciplinary design doctorate program, taking into account one of your theories. The world's best research center now have recruited almost all of our graduates. This has shown us all that your theory is a woefully correct prediction. 10 years ago, you honored us by connecting to opening of our doctoral program. It is a pleasure to welcome you again in our 10th year of celebration. I'm curious, what has changed in your view compared to 10 years ago? Which of your predictions that they come true today, but more importantly, which of your predictions are different today? If so, what could be the reason?
I think a lot has changed, and I think a lot more still has to change. When 10 years ago, design was not well thought of. Design was something that made things look pretty. Whether it was devices or even architecture. In architecture, you were awarded a prize on usually a perspective from above, showing this wonderful new device, building or a house that you had designed, often from an angle that nobody could ever be at. This was the age before drones. And nobody talked about whether it actually fit the lives of the inhabitants, whether it was good to work in. Whether it was useful. And I shouldn't say nobody, there were a few champions, but the general architectural profession did not. But the same was true in the general design fields. For example, one of the problems was that design was thought of as a part of art. And design students often were in art departments, and they weren't even well respected in the art departments. And in the university itself, design had a middle level. And when you got a job, either you were at the mercy of your clients, if you were in a consultancy, or if you worked for a company, you were in the middle level. And even if you thought this was the wrong product and it was being done badly, nobody ever asked for your opinion and nobody listened. That has changed a lot. And I think design is starting to be respected, but it's not fully understood. And so many of the changes that I hoped would happen are starting to. So I have great hopes. And actually, I will tell you about my new book because it's all about this. And actually, I should show you a copy of it. But this is the book. And it actually gets at some of the questions you've asked. It's called Design for a Better World. All right. But the terms are meaningful, sustainable, humanity-centered. Now, one of the questions you're going to ask me about is human-centered design versus humanity-centered design, and that's an important key. And notice I talk about meaningful. When has design really talked about meaning? And here I'm actually complaining about the economists of the world who give us meaningless numbers. That, your gross domestic product is lower than that of other countries. Well, the gross domestic product is a stupid, inane measure that measures the good as well as the bad. And by the way, major economists all say this. I'm not alone, but we could persist in using it. The second is sustainability, which I think everybody today begins to realize is an important criterion, but that didn't exist 10 years ago. There was almost no discussion about it. Mind you, the designers have talked about this since the 1970s. That's 50 years ago, if not longer. But in fact, the world has not paid much attention. And finally, what do I mean by humanity-centered? What's the difference between that and human-centered? But there's one other interesting thing, and that's actually, I like this panel because it represents this. Designers should not be just design. We have to understand more of the world. We have to understand more disciplines. So I'm delighted to hear there's some engineering here. There's architects mixed with traditional designers. And I'd like to see even a richer range of education. Because after all, we're going to impact the world. Therefore, we need to understand the world.
So you are educated both as an engineer and a psychologist, and you say that you lived many lives under various professions. And you also emphasize that the definitions for these professions do not really matter. My question is, how do you think this diverse background of yours contributed to your vision for design and cognitive engineering?
I think that the university is to blame for a lot of the ailments, because the university is well intended, but what the major universities of the world, which is often called the research universities of the world, have tried to do is get the most excellent, the best scholars in each field. And you were rewarded as a professor by the depth of your knowledge and how much you've helped create. So therefore, you had to publish in highly qualified, peer-reviewed journals, and you had to work alone. And so universities have insisted on professors working by themselves to get their own credit, to build their own abilities. And the reward structure, therefore, sort of implied that you should work to create your own expertise by yourself. Well, the world doesn't work that way, and it shouldn't work that way. The world works collaboratively. Yet, if you collaborate with a number of people, how do we know how much you did? That's nonsense. Second, publication, yes. But, if I develop some new procedure that saves 1,000 lives, my university says, that's nice. If I write a paper that gets published in the journal Nature or the journal Science, I get promoted. Now, we need to have experts, but the experts speak to experts. And if we take a look at the climate change problem, the experts in climate change have been complaining about the dangers that are happening for 20 years, but who did they talk to? They talked to themselves. They published arcane scientific journals in language that we could not understand, and they only talked to themselves, and they wondered why nobody listened. They didn't understand what it took in the world to make a difference. For example, we've been told that, oh my goodness, if the temperature changes 1.8 degrees Celsius from what it was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it will be horrible. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when was that? Oh, the 1700s. 1.8 degrees Celsius? It changes more than that every day, up and down, up and down. What are you talking about? So the problem is that the climate scientists they study climate. People don't care about climate. People care about weather. Weather is what happens every day. Climate is just global changes. And 1.8 degrees Celsius is a lot of heat when across the world measured in decades. But the average person doesn't understand that. And that's what I mean when we have to say, let's talk in meaningful things, what it means to your life, what we're talking about. And so we need to train people to, first of all, be able to talk to ordinary people. Second of all, to work in groups. And third of all, when you're doing something that makes a difference in the world, your narrow specialty is very important, but it can't do it by itself. We have to work with many other disciplines. We have to work with politicians for big projects. We have to work with business people. We have to work with people from all areas of the university. The humanities are often laughed at because they don't do science. No, but they understand people and civilization and ways of thinking. And so because of the universities, we are a world of specialists. And we need specialists, but we need generalists as well, people who can put it all together. And personally, the best profession to do this, in my opinion, is the design profession, because design doesn't have any content. We have procedures and methods, and those are very effective. We focus on people, and that's very important and pretty unique, because we focus on people while we also understand the real world. We understand technology. We understand how this fits into people's lives. And so we ought to be the leaders. Now, we can't lead unless we have many, many other disciplines working together. And actually, we aren't going to be leading because no single discipline is the most important. What's important is how we all collaborate to do better things.
As you probably mentioned in your recent book you showed us, since 1980s, the term human-centered has been considered as an individualistic perspective, and its impact on the industry can be observed on relatively short notice that time. So what difference does humanity-centered offer that the human-centered approach did not have? And following that, how might we address it in design education? Could you please elaborate more on this perspective?
I remember that early on, as I was starting to develop the ideas for this book, I talked to a friend about what I was going to write. And she said that, no, I was wrong. I was too narrow. That why don't I take a wider perspective? And I was kind of shocked because I always thought I did take a wide perspective. But she convinced me that no, I should not focus on people. I should not focus on the current state of the world. I should focus on the whole picture, which is humanity, which is the ecological system, which is the lives of all living things, plants, animals, all peoples, about the wide variety of cultures in the world, about the important knowledge that comes from the indigenous people in the world, about the history of the world. There's a saying that people who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. That's false. History doesn't repeat itself. But what is true is that history determines how we act today. You know, there's an old saying in that if you can't measure something, it means you don't understand it. And this comes from Lord Kelvin, the same Kelvin as in the Kelvin scale of temperature, who said that if when in a field you cannot if you don't measure anything, it really means you are at the very primitive basis of the field. And so that law, I was taught that when I was an engineering student. I had to measure everything. And second, all the other fields, economics especially, but the humanities, the psychology, the social sciences, all believe that you must measure and measure and measure and measure, even things that can't be measured. And worse than that, we measure it on units that don't make any sense. The economists have caused us to measure many things in terms of money, euros or dollars. Why? Now, what people don't realize is they left out the first few words of his sentence. That isn't quite what he said. He said, in the physical sciences. In the physical sciences, if you can't measure, it means you don't understand. But let me tell you something. Here's a pencil. If I drop it, I can measure how fast it drops and so on. If I now drop it again, the fact that I just dropped it makes no difference. It will drop the same way. In the physical sciences, it's not what we call it's path independent. Its history of how it got to this particular point doesn't matter. Now, if I dropped a person, it would fall in a particular way. And if I dropped that same person a second time, it would be very different. Living things react, change according to their history. And so it isn't that if you don't study history, you might repeat exactly what went wrong before. No. But if you don't study history, you won't understand why it is that people believe that what they are doing is proper and normal. What is a week? How many days in a week? Where did that come from? It was invented. It makes no sense. Some cultures don't have weeks. Some cultures have weeks of different numbers of days. No, look, the notion of a day makes some sense because the sun goes around the earth, that's our mental model, and it comes back again in one day. A year makes sense because, well, in this case, the earth goes around the sun and it comes back to the same point 1 year later by definition. But seasons, do they make sense? How many seasons are there? Most of the West assumes there are 4 seasons, but some cultures have 6 seasons. Some cultures have 0 seasons. If you live on the equator, seasons don't make any sense. And what about the hour? What about the laws? What about the notion of countries? What about the way we live? What about whether you should eat with your right hand and never with your left, or whether you should use utensils, whether you're allowed to pick up something with your fingers? I like to eat soup because I just take the bowl and drink like that. That's against the etiquette of most countries, not all. It's perfectly correct in Japan. But when I try to use a spoon, which is the way the Western world does, I usually spill it over myself. But we don't realize that. Almost nobody thinks that the way they eat or the way that we use calendars is artificial. And so that's what the history matters. Whatever you're born into and live in your early lives, you assume is natural. It never occurs that you might change it. So that's another important point. So when it comes to human-centered design, what was the origins of design as a profession? It was in the early factories in England to help sell more products. And design has always been a tool of industry to improve the profits and sales. And in the modern design, instead of focusing upon the object itself, we now focus upon the people we're designing for, but we're still designing for the individual person, human-centered. It used to be called user-centered, and then we switched to the name human-centered or even people-centered, but we're focusing on individuals or small groups. Well, what do we manufacture? We manufacture things that destroy the environment when we mine the world for the materials, that destroy the environment when we manufacture it and belch out and pollute the air and the water and the land. And then when it's finished, in fact, in order to have profits, we make something that doesn't last for very long. And so this is a normal design. In architecture, it's slightly different, but still similar. So if you take a look at the modern cell phone and computer, you can't fix it. In order to make it thin and light and beautiful, we glue it together. We make it out of exotic materials that cannot be separated again and reused, so that if you take it apart, you destroy all the valuable stuff inside. So we pollute the world or we throw it away. I've been to India where there are mountains of electronic trash piled high, burning because the batteries cause a lot of heat and cause fires and polluting the air. So we had to stop all of that. And so that's why I use the term humanity-centered design. Now, some people say, no, you should talk about life-centered, you should talk about other things. Well, there is no proper words, because if you want to use a shorthand of, say, 3 words, there's no way that you can really convey the deep meaning of what those 3 words mean. We have to convey the meaning by what we do. So humanity-centered design was a term that's been around about 15 years, and it hasn't been widely accepted. But I decided that was a good term to describe what I want to do, to think about all of these things, life, the ecological system, and so on. I think you're all beginning to realize now, if you ask me a question, you get a lecture back. But these are important questions, and I think they do deserve more than just a sentence or 2 to respond.
Following the importance of humanity-centered design and the ecosystem, in your book, you mentioned that we live in a world that is unsustainable due to many reasons, for example, such as political or economical issues. And you suggest that design may get us out of this mess, just as it got us into it. So my question is, given the wickedness of this picture, what would be the ABCs or the initial steps in arriving at a new form of design?
Well, as you may also know, I'm part of a large movement to study the future of design education. You have 700 people who have said they're interested, and about 100 to 200 who are actively working on this. We've been trying to change how we are teaching design. This project has been going now, this is the 3rd year. We're actually hoping to finish by the end of this year, and we're going to publish our results in a special issue, perhaps 2 special issues of the design journal, Shed. That's a problem, by the way, that we're going to publish these wonderful results in a journal that not even all designers have heard of. So we have to figure out another way of distributing the information. But it will discuss each of the different areas of design that we are looking at, and try to say what is really needed for the future. And actually, what is the role of the university? Now, universities are strange too, because first of all, it's part of this trend in the Western world. And the Western world, which is primarily Europe, but I include the United States, the word West is not a geographical term. It's those, because Australia is part of the Western world, for example. Turkey is part of the Western world. Because it's those who are dominated by the educational practices of Europe, which has infected all over the world. And so we all learn the same things. We're all taught the same things. And as you go around the world, the stores are the same, the goods are the same. If you go to the universities, the professors are all similar. They're all educated in similar ways. We want to change that. We want to take advantage of the differences in cultures and different ways that different people think and use that not as a problem, but as an opportunity to have a richer, more wonderful life. So, I think that we have to change the educational system because we have to be continually learning throughout our lives. And we might, in fact, stop educating from when you're very young to when you're in the early 20s, and then we stop and you never get educated again. But maybe distribute it more. One of the problems is we educate people about important things when they don't care. They don't give a damn. They have no idea why they're trying to be taught this, and therefore they don't learn anything. Later on in life, they begin to realize why it's important. So that's when they should be taught. I'm the same way. When I went to engineering school, I had to learn about Western history and Greek philosophy and that. And I thought, yeah, why this? I wasn't interested at all. I didn't care at all. I wanted to know the latest equations and the latest technologies, the latest this and that. And I did not care about history. It was like 20 or 30 years later when I realized how important that was. So I began to study it myself and make friends with professors in those areas and learn from them. Or when I went to business, I would learn from other people in other disciplines with whom I worked, because I was ready then. And that's a good example. So we have to change that. One other thing I'm going to mention is architecture, because it's recently come up. I got a letter from a woman, actually, I think she was in Turkey, saying she's an architecture student and wondered what I thought about the modern architecture. And the problem that we talked about in our email correspondence was that today we build these wonderful, beautiful buildings. They may or may not fit the way that people work and need them, but they ignore completely the environment in which they are located. They ignore whether it's hot or cold or sunny or what, because we have such really good, efficient heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. Well, air conditioning is one of the problems. Did you know that when an air conditioner puts more heat into the atmosphere than it removes from the building, because they're not fully efficient. And therefore, the use of this, there are 3 billion air conditioners in the world, and that increases the temperature of the atmosphere, which makes it warmer for everybody, which means we have to use the air conditioners more. It's a positive cycle that's doing harm. But why are we using air conditioners? If you look at the indigenous communities of the world, they learned how to build buildings that didn't require heating, ventilation, or even if they did, it was a minimum amount. I just recently went to Tijuana, Mexico, and which is just a few miles. I can even see it right out the window there, Mexico. And there was a real new building, wonderful, beautiful. It was all glass, and there were no ledges. So the point is, the sun, which was very, very hot that day, is shining right into the building, requires heavy use of air conditioning. If they would have had ledges, ledges are very good because the sun in the summer is higher. And so that would cause the windows to be in shade. And the summer and the winter is lower. So that allows the sun to go in and warm up the inside of the building. And people made wind towers. If you can design the building properly, you get the heat at the bottom, which automatically rises to the center of the building, which causes a nice breeze to go through and bringing cold air in and getting rid of the hot air. And there are all sorts of techniques that we have completely forgotten because we overpower it with technology. But the use of that technology, we destroy the earth in mining to get the technology to make the electricity, to transmit the electricity all around the world on these big transmission lines, and et cetera, et cetera. So how do we change this education? It's a different kind of education, one that takes into account the entire world, our entire history, and is aimed not at deep, wonderful, detailed papers, but it aimed at real methods that can go out in the world and make a difference. Once again, the design community is a community that builds things, that does things. Now, some of the things we build are not physical. There may be a new method of doing something, a new procedure, but we're building it. We need to train people to do that more, and that's not what is reinforced in the university.
We talked a lot about the change today, and concepts commonly adopted in design constantly change over time. For example, human-centeredness, humanity-centeredness, beyond human-centeredness, etc. Accordingly, design practice and design education should constantly reflect and upon themselves, reflect and update themselves methodologically, ethically, etc. Compared to other disciplines, perhaps we can talk that the fact that design is a more dynamic discipline. So to evaluate the current scene, how do you think design responds to this need for constant adaptation? I was wondering about your thought.
Well, actually, I don't believe that design is any different than other disciplines, that all disciplines have to respond to changes. Let me take history, for example, the discipline of history. Some American politicians have complained about history because, well, you know, if you take a look at events, major events in history, historians keep writing about them. Why? Shouldn't you just do one good study and now you know the answer? And now why is it you have to keep writing a different book about the same events? That's because our perspectives change. The president of the United States said that's revisionist history. We're revising our impression of what happened in history. Yes, that's what history is all about. Because actually, you know, even if you try to say what happened today in a particular event, depending on who you ask or who you study, you'll get different answers. Everybody will have a different opinion of what happened today. And now if you wait 100 years or several hundred years, of course, our understanding of the world has changed. We have new information about what happened in the past. And so we must always be changing our views of the past because that is how we understand the present. And I believe there is no discipline that is immune from this. Every discipline has to rethink where it is moving. And in fact, if anything, design is the one that has been behind the scene, behind in this. We still teach traditional craft methods when we teach design. Why is that? Now, the traditional craft methods may be appropriate for something, but it's not necessarily appropriate for everything. To be a design student today, you have to be a pretty good artist. You have to be able to draw and render and do things, make beautiful things. And even if that's not what you do in your life, if you're a service designer, you're not building physical things. So why do I have to learn to draw and sketch and all this? I can't do it because I wasn't trained as a designer, fortunately. So I don't know some of those wonderful skills. I appreciate them. I'm not saying we should eliminate them, but it's not clear why that's required of every single designer. But there are some things that should be required, which is the way we think. Now, this has been changing over the years. What's something called design thinking. If you look at the history of the early great designers, they were doing design thinking, and they even called it that. But the notion of what is design thinking has been changing over and over again. And today it has been perverted to be a simple little exercise you can learn in a couple of hours or maybe a week. and then go off and you're now a designer. Well, we are all designers, it's true. But we're all tennis players also. But there's a big difference between the way I play tennis and the way that professionals play tennis. And there's a big difference between the way that amateur designers or architects, people who design their own homes or build their own things, they're very clever, they understand their own needs. But, you know, when I've built several homes in my life, we seem to have gone through that. Every time we move, we decide we don't like the new house, so we build a new house. But yes, my wife and I have firm ideas about what we want, but then we call in a good architect to make it happen. So I think that the fact that we are changing is important. And I believe that all of these changes are for the good. In fact, people say, how come I changed my profession so many times? I was an electrical engineer, and then I was a computer scientist, and then I became a psychologist, and then I became a cognitive scientist, and then I became a business executive. And then, mind you, as a business executive, I was none of this. I was the vice president of advanced technology, which meant I was in charge of all sorts of different applications in different fields. In fact, things I didn't understand, which was wonderful, because when I didn't understand, I would go to the person who was working on it and say, okay, here's what I'd like you to do for the next few weeks. I want you to spend a few hours every day or every week with me and teach me until I do understand. And so it was a really great education. And so among the things I did was I went to the United States Congress, and I walked the halls of the Congress. I was a lobbyist, I guess. And then I also went to the Federal Communications Commission and asked for bandwidth, very expensive bandwidth, which today we call the Wi-Fi bands. And then I worked with the FCC to work on the television standards for high definition television, which the Japanese wanted to be analog and we wanted to be digital. And there were differences between the Japanese, between the Americans, and similarities with Europe, but still differences. And then we managed. But how do we train people to have this kind of breadth? We should, it was valuable. When I changed fields from to field to field to field to finally that of design, it was because I had this other background that I was able to be successful in the new field. Because what I discovered was that, especially early on, the things that were common sense in engineering, that is common sense, it was so fundamental to the way we thought that we just never realized where it came from. And I come into psychology and I tell them something that was common sense to every engineer. The psychologist said, "Oh, how brilliant!" And then when I moved to business, and when I moved, each time I would move, I could take some general idea from the old field and put it in the new field, and they would say, "Oh, what a brilliant insight! You are a brilliant person." No, I'm not. So I think that we need to revolutionize the entire educational system, and that will help revolutionize each of our fields. We have a lot of very valuable knowledge, but the way it's so segregated and so specialized and in such language and other people cannot understand is what we need to change.
Dawn, are you hopeful for future of the world?
I have to be. The way I keep going is that I'm always optimistic. In fact, writing this book where I had to describe a lot of the horrors that have happened over history and a lot of the problems that are happening today, the hardest part was to keep being optimistic the whole time. And actually, I usually, when I write a book, I teach it because my students are very critical. The students, especially in America, they like to show the professor is wrong. They like to criticize what they're being told. And that's very important because sometimes the students are right. And if I'm wrong, please tell me, because if I'm wrong, I don't want to keep doing that. I want to change. Or if I'm wrong, if you think I'm wrong, but I don't think so, well, that might mean that I'm not explaining it well. Okay. And so I'm still learning from your feedback. And so Yeah, I try to be optimistic. It's very important because, look, as my students said, when they looked at the early version of this, they said, the problem with your book, it's all doom and gloom about how bad everything is and the world is collapsing. No, nobody wants to hear doom and gloom. And that reminded me of what the lessons I learned as an executive in a business. When people would come to me and tell me about problems, I would say, I don't want to hear about your problems. It's not that I want to be ignorant. I want to understand. I do want to know actually what's going wrong. But I don't want you to come and tell me that there's some big problem. What I want you to do is come and tell me what the solution is. And so the way to keep positive is not to keep saying, here's what's wrong, here's what's wrong, here's what's wrong. The way to keep positive is to say, here's how we should be doing it instead. And that's why in this book I talk, there's no new idea in this book. What's new about the book is the way I combine ideas other people have had. So in economics, there's this wonderful woman in Oxford, England, who has a new way. She calls it donut economics. And it's a way of presenting economics in a way that is immediately understandable by everybody. And you can do instead of the gross domestic product, which is a single number that doesn't mean anything, she has this wonderful graph. It's on a donut, so that on the upper part of the graph, she puts different lines showing how we are wrecking the ecology of the world. And here's because you're doing introducing more carbon dioxide, or here because you're polluting with nitrogen, or here because you're doing this, or here because you're doing that. And on the inside of the donut, she has lines going in, which is the social impact. Here, you're not educating properly. Here, you have poverty. Here, you have famine, hunger. And it's a really wonderful way of explaining things. And so everything in this book, that's what keeps me positive. Because every time I thought there was something wrong, I could find all sorts of good people who are doing it right. The sustainability issue, well, there's a whole emphasis on what's called the circular economy, devising things where we, just like nature is really interesting because it reuses everything. When an animal or a plant dies, it goes back into the earth and everything is reused by other animals or by other plants. And why can't we do that in our manufacturing? And it's called the circular economy, and to designers, circular design. Now that requires a change in business practices. So I talk about how that might occur. So that's why I keep optimistic.
Thank you, Dawn, for your wonderful talk in our celebrating 10th years of PhD program. It's quite memorable for us. In this episode, we hosted Dawn Norman as celebrating 10th anniversary of our design PhD program. This is Koç University Design Lab, Istanbul Studios.